So today's video we are again focusing on the Fractal high contrast build. If you are a regular viewer of the Kit Guru YouTube channel, you might remember we started this build several months ago. It's been going on for quite a while, but recently, if you are a follower on our TikTok channel, you may have seen a few updates from me showing a bit of progress on the work that I've been doing in preparation for this video today. So because of that, I've actually done some of the modding off camera. You may have seen the updates on TikTok, but we've saved the best bit for our YouTube viewers because the plan today is to get this build complete, get the system fired up, check it's all working, and sign it off as a finished system. You might remember the case started off as a standard white Fractal Meshify 2. The idea behind this system is to flip the orientation of the motherboard and have all the tubing for the water cooling running vertically from the top of the system to each individual component. So there's been a lot of work on the case, modifying that so that it will work in that way, and it looks like we will have achieved that because we've now got the rear I/O that's down on the bottom above the power supply shroud. On the back of the case is a custom panel to house some fans. There will be a 280mm radiator in the front, a 280 in the back, and the airflow will come in from the front and out at the back of the system. So let me get on to what I've actually been doing in preparation for this video. So there's been a fair bit of work to get this ready for today. The case, like I say, started off white. I've given it a full satin black spray job, and you can see there's some yellow highlights because the theme of the system is this high contrast theme. So we've gone with a yellow and black, so the yellow should stand out against the black background nicely. You'll see the majority of the case is black, but there's some highlights such as the top and front mesh that's in the yellow. I've made this acrylic kind of motherboard cover, or the motherboard tray cover, so that's a nice and yellow background you'll see, and that'll be a nice contrast with the motherboard. These black bits either side of the motherboard, they'll be covered up by the radiators. That's why the acrylic panel is only as long as it is. I've also added some acrylic to the underside of the power supply shroud, so that kind of mesh pattern that comes on the Meshify 2 case stands out nicely. And there's been a few other mods to the case, so just basically cutting out the original motherboard tray to allow for the cables to pass through in the new places, because obviously the orientation will have changed. So case is ready, I think. The motherboard, this is the Asus Strix B550E gaming motherboard. Not a lot has been done to this, just some subtle mods, just added some yellow highlights, so that's ready to go. And then the water cooling gear, so this is the EK magnitude block, and I've just painted the outer mounting frame yellow as well to match the theme. I've added some braided sleeving to the pump. The pump's not really going to be seen because it's going to be mounted underneath the power supply shroud, but this cable will obviously plug into the motherboard, so I've sleeved that in the yellow. And one of the major components of the system is this EK flat reservoir. So this was originally just a standard EK FLT 240 flat reservoir, but I've kind of converted it into a distro plate, so that will be in the top of the case. And then I've drilled out the holes for the fittings, put the fittings in where the tubing is going to come down to the CPU and the GPU block. And if you could just see under there as well, I've added some baffles to the distro plate so that the water will flow in the direction we need, and there won't be any stagnant areas of the coolant. So that's ready to go into the system as well. I've done a bit of work on the radiators, not too much, it's only subtle mods on these. The radiators come in a black finish from EK, but it's a real matte finish and it shows up every fingerprint and mark really easily. So I've just painted these in the same satin black finish as the case, and I've just added this biohazard logo. This was just a stencil. I've just sprayed that yellow, and also some decals. I've been working on the cables as well, so these are some custom cables that I've made up from scratch, and these are using AMD PCIe sleeving, and you see these again or a similar theme with the yellow highlight. So there's a 24-pin, the PCIe, and the EPS cables. They've all been made up from scratch. So that's more or less everything I've been working on behind the scenes in preparation for today's video. A lot of the mods on the case were done in the previous video, so if you've not seen those already, I suggest you go back and watch those because it'll give you a better idea of how we've got to this point with the case and the flipped motherboard orientation. But today's video, like I said, is all about getting the system finished, getting it built up, powering it on, making sure everything's working right after the mods, and then hopefully by the end of this video, we'll all get to see what this system looks like when it's completed. So I think it's time for less talking, more action. Let's get on with building the system. Okay, so we got there in the end. I don't know how it came across on the video, but it took a little bit longer than I expected. I had to make a couple of, shall we say, minor tweaks to the system as I was going along building it. For the most part, the build went as expected, but it was when I came to actually filling up and testing the system, I had to make those few tweaks. So the first one was one of these top connections to the radiator. How I'd got it piped up, it was putting a bit of extra pressure on one of the rotary offset connections, and it actually made it leak. Luckily, I'd not filled the system up then. I was just pressure testing it with the EK pressure tester. So I had to just slightly change how I'd done the pipe work for them. I got rid of a couple of fittings and put some bent pipes in instead. The other, shall we say, the other major change that I made, it wasn't so major really, it was more of a tweak to the distro plate, a few tweaks to the distro plate actually. The first time I filled it, I noticed that when I powered the system up and the pump started running, the coolant was kind of bypassing the baffles I'd made in the distro plate, or at least they weren't working as well as I was hoping. So I had to make a bit of a tweak to that. I took the whole distro plate out, disassembled it. I had to add some seals just to the tops of the baffles, and then that stopped the coolant bypassing it. It still has a slight bypass around the sides, but the easiest direction of flow now is the one that I set with the baffle. So that's working now as I want it to. The coolant passes through the distro plate exactly how I need it to, and it gets to the CPU and GPU as I expected. So that was one of the tweaks, or that was the major tweak that I had to make to the system. The other change I had to make to the distro plate, I noticed that when I came to filling the system and trying to bleed the air out of the system, I did anticipate that it was going to be difficult with the distro plate at the top, but I did have to make another tweak. So I added another fill port to the top of the distro plate, which made it a lot easier for filling. I was thinking I could probably just tip the system on the side and fill it from the original ports that the distro plate had, or it had when it was just a flat reservoir, but adding that extra port on the top made it a lot easier to fill, and it also made it a lot easier to bleed out the air bubbles. There's one or two small air bubbles still left in the system, but I'll be able to bleed those out easier. I was able to kind of rig up an expansion tank, and then the air passed out through that expansion tank a lot easier. One of the other tweaks that I made to the system, or changes, and again I knew I was going to have to do this, was the connections for your keyboard and mouse, monitors and stuff like that. Obviously flipping the orientation of the motherboard puts the motherboard I/O and the graphics card I/O at the bottom of the system on top of the power supply shroud. I remember one or two comments on previous videos when I was planning the system out saying that the power supply would block the motherboard ports. It does to a certain extent. It blocks about the first 50 millimeters. Luckily on this motherboard that only means a couple of USB 2 ports have limited access. It's difficult to plug into, but I think if you did buy some right angled extensions, you would still be able to use those ports, but I don't think they're too important, those USB 2 ports at the minute. You can still get to the Type C port, you can still get to all the Type A USB 3 ports, Ethernet connection is accessible still, and all the audio connections as well. So I ended up just basically cutting out a hole at the back of the chassis and using one of the original grommets from the motherboard tray just to tidy it up, and now you can just simply pass the cables through and plug them in pretty easily. It's probably easy if you lay the system down and you can actually see through the base of the case, the case floor where it's mesh, and you can plug them in quite easily. So that's not too much of a big deal. I suppose if you've got the system further away on a desk, you might need some extensions because your standard cables might not reach, but I had no problem at all plugging keyboard and mouse in. Monitor cable might be a bit of a stretch, but other than that, they're basically all the changes I made. Oh, I also changed the wiring as well to the EK pump. Instead of using the SATA connection, I just snipped that off, crimped some new pins on, and made a direct connection to the power supply because there's no other SATA power needed in the system. I thought it was pointless having those extra cables in, so it's a direct connection straight to the power supply. I like to do that as well if I'm not using SATA for anything else. or if it's a custom build, it just looks a lot neater, connected up directly to the power supply. But other than that, it's turned out looking exactly as I was hoping. Probably if I did this type of build again with a distro plate on the top, I would probably go the whole hog and do a completely custom distro plate rather than trying to convert the flat res into it. But it does work, it looks good, and I'm happy with how it's turned out. Because it's been so long since we actually started planning this build, it goes back months, maybe even a year, the system specification is a little outdated now. There is newer AMD processors and newer graphics cards that have come out, but I'll just give you a quick reminder of what we've got inside the system. So the CPU is an AMD Ryzen 7 5800X, just running at its base frequency now, but no problem overclocking with this cooling system. Motherboard is the Asus Strix B550E Gaming. Did some minor tweaks to that motherboard, just slightly changed the color scheme so it matched with the high contrast yellow. Memory is 32 gigabytes of Corsair Dominator Platinum RGB, it's DDR4 3600. The graphics card is a Palit RTX 3080 Gaming Pro. We've obviously taken off the stock cooler and put EK water block on that. Storage is a WD Black SN850 M.2 NVMe PCIe Gen 4 drive. Chassis is obviously a Fractal Meshify 2. It's been heavily modified. Originally it was a white Meshify 2. It's got this custom paint job. I flipped the motherboard orientation, so that meant a lot of modifications to the chassis. The rear panel was cut out, a new rear panel, laser cut out of mild steel that houses the rear fans and rear radiator. Flipping the motherboard orientation meant I also had to move the rear I/O, so the rear I/O has been cut out. The power supply shroud modified to accept that, and I had to make a motherboard adapter plate up as well to allow for the change in the orientation of the motherboard. Power supply is a Fractal design Ion Plus 2, so that's an 860 watt 80 plus platinum unit. No real mods as such to the power supply, but I did make a full set of custom cables from scratch in the same yellow and black theme to match the rest of the system. The fans in the system are 4 Fractal design Aspect 14, so they're 140mm fans and RGB. All the RGB in the system is currently running in a static yellow to match the rest of the theme, apart from the RAM, which has a custom theme going on. I did actually do a little tweak to the RAM as well. When I installed the RAM with the motherboard in this orientation, the Dominator logo was upside down, so I was able to partly disassemble the RAM and flip that over, so now you can see the Dominator logo the correct way up. The cooling system is a full EK custom loop. The CPU block is an EK Quantum Magnitude block. GPU is an EK Quantum Vector RE for reference edition, RTX 3080 and 3090. It's the nickel and acetal version, so it's pretty stealthy looking all black version. The pump is an EK Quantum Inertia D5, so it's a standalone pump that's mounted underneath the power supply shroud. Again, RGB lighting on that is set to yellow like the rest of the system. The radiators are the older EK Coolstream. These are the Coolstream CE280. One at the front in the original housing, and then one is installed at the back in the custom panel that I had laser cut. The fittings are all EK torque fittings. The tubing is 14mm, so they are the 14mm fittings. You can get these in various different versions. These are satin titanium finish, and there's multiple different types. So there's straights, 90s, offsets, 45 degrees, loads of different types of fittings you can choose from now with those torque fittings. And then the only thing that's not EK is the tubing, and that was the Corsair Hydro X XT Hardline satin black tubing. I really like that tubing, like to use it, and it works well with these EK torque fittings. So that's the Fractal high contrast build finished. As I said, if I was going to do this build again, I may have changed one or two things slightly, but I can't argue with the thermal performance, how it's configured at the moment, because as you can see, I've got the 3D Mark Time Spy benchmark, or the stress test, running in a loop. It's been going now for about 20 minutes or so, and the GPU temperature sat at 42 degrees, which is perfect. I also ran the Cinebench R23 stress test again in a loop for 30 minutes, and CPU temperature peaked at 70 degrees, so that is absolutely ideal. And the system looks exactly as I'd hoped it would do when we started this build several months ago. We've achieved the main goal of the system as well, was flipping the motherboard orientation and putting radiators front and rear, so I'm really happy with how it's turned out. Let me know what you think of the finished system in the comment section. Is this the type of system you'd like to build or you'd like to own? Please let me know. The system will be going back to Fractal now, Not sure what they're going to do with it, but it's going to be shipped off back to them. So I hope you've enjoyed watching this video. I hope you've enjoyed watching this series, the Fractal high contrast build. If you've enjoyed it, don't forget to hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel if you've not already done so. If you enjoy what we do here at Kit Guru and you want to help support us, you can always head over to the store and pick up some of the merch, or you could subscribe to our Patreon. And as always, if you want to catch up on all the in-depth technical reviews, head over to the website.